Did you know that you are incredible, one of a kind, and that there is no one else on this planet who is exactly like you? Pretty awesome, huh? I'm sorry, I probably should have gotten your consent first before reading something so incredibly sexually explicit to you. I apologize. For Pride Cymru 2019, I was asked to do a drag queen storytime reading in front of kids. The books I read were family-friendly children's books, and I was dressed head to toe on a warm summer day with a shirt that read, "You totally can." If I had been a cisgender female librarian, the action I carried out during that Pride event would have been considered the most normal thing ever. However, because I am queer, if this reading had happened in the modern day, right now, I would have received accusations of being a groomer. So why didn't this happen in 2019? What in the last few years has changed with the public's perception of drag artistry, gender nonconformity, and the transgender community? Let's talk about it.
Hooray, Roy! Hooray, Silo! Welcome, Tango, they cheered. At night, the three penguins returned to their nest. There they snuggled together and, like all the other penguins in the penguin house, and all the other animals in the zoo, and all the families in the big city around them, they went to sleep. And Tango makes three. Thank you guys so much. My name is Bella Tempest, which means good time. I hope that you have all had a good time listening to these wonderfully charming stories. And Pride Happus, have an amazing Pride. Enjoy yourself.
Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I did in fact use this set in a video last year, and when I used this set before, people accused me of surrounding myself with books because I didn't actually have anything intelligent to say, and those people were incredibly rude. I've read all of these books and I'm extremely smart. But if you want to help me afford new sets, listen, I would not be opposed. Okay, let's get into part one. As long as we've understood the concept of sex, we've formed a societal construction of gender around it, and that construction has ebbed and flowed in different directions since the beginning of time. But there have always been people who have diverged from expectations and norms surrounding gender. There have been times when gender has been very societally policed, and there have been times when it has been less policed. The gold rush in 1849 led to a mass global migration of mostly male laborers to Northern California and the development of government-backed economic interests in the Pacific Northwest region of the modern United States. The sudden explosive population increase resulted in a huge demand to import commodities like food, tools, sex, and entertainment to these new male-oriented homogeneous societies. As these societies evolved over the following decades, the growing demand for entertainment created a unique opportunity for male cross-dressers to perform. Cross-dressing was actually encouraged for entertainment purposes due to a lack of women, but the tolerance for the acts was limited to onstage roles, and it did not extend to gender identities or same-sex desires. Julian Eltinge was a female impersonator in the 1800s who performed in saloons in Montana as a kid, eventually making it to the Broadway stage and exemplifying this limited social acceptance for cross-dressing. His cross-dressing performances were celebrated by laborers who were starved for entertainment, but his career was put at risk when he was exposed for exhibiting homosexual desires and behaviors. This hypocrisy has existed throughout a lot of history. In Shakespearean times, cross-dressing as part of theater was normal because women weren't allowed to act. And even in the modern day, we see examples of cross-dressing being incredibly accepted in mainstream entertainment, such as with Mrs. Doubtfire, a very famous, very widely accepted film that features cross-dressing as one of the key elements of the story. So evidently cross-dressing is completely fine when it serves men in power for entertainment, even erotic entertainment. Matt Bernstein, a leftist activist on Instagram, also made the excellent point that men in power are also allowed to cross-dress. Many of the Republicans involved in current anti-trans and anti-drag legislation have actually cross-dressed, supported, or even performed in drag themselves. But when it comes to the queer public sphere, there's a double standard, and that double standard has a long history of throwing vulnerable peoples into jail at the whims of the police. In 1863, San Francisco became the first place in the US to engage a ban on gender nonconformity, a so-called cross-dressing or masquerade ordinance, which prohibited someone from being out in public if they were wearing clothing that was different from their legal or assigned sex. These laws were used well into the 20th century to imperil and harass but also silence LGBTQ+ people. If you were arrested, which was incredibly easy under the way these laws were written, your name might be published in the newspaper, you'd have a criminal record for the rest of your life, and it could ruin your employment chances and out you to everybody. Because these laws were so vaguely worded, it became less of a legal matter and more of a policing matter. If the police decided they wanted to arrest you, anybody, and usually this meant marginalized people, could become the targets of police violence using the justification of these laws. Just a couple years ago, New York repealed a law which affected loitering and was primarily used by the police to target people they perceived as prostitutes, which could include anybody who is cross-dressing. This association with cross-dressing and prostitution can be seen as a historical origin for the conflation with gender nonconformity and something adult, erotic, or explicit. There is actual history behind people cross-dressing to entertain sexually or to be made available for prostitution, which dates all the way back to men who dressed as women in Victorian times called mollies. But even with a historical precedence, this conflation in the modern day is completely artificial. There's no empirical way that you can say that a man wearing a skirt is sexual. That's not measurable. But that hasn't stopped the right wing from deciding to start accusing literally every single member of the LGBTQ+ community of being a literal pedophile just for existing. Kaylin Conrad made a really great video entitled "What is a Groomer?", which delves into the rise of this new attack on LGBTQ+ individuals by members of the right wing, and I'll link to that here. Okay, this is actually really uncomfortable, and I love that it's like showing off the boots. I mean, the boots are beautiful, but you know, it's a little bit impractical. Just gonna reposition here 1 second. Grooming is now a word that has no meaning according to the right wing, and it applies to everyone who is LGBTQ+. But there's two groups in particular who are receiving this word the most, and that's trans people and drag queens. In the case of drag queens, all of drag artistry has now been suddenly labeled sexually provocative and inappropriate for children, and drag queen story times are being threatened by alt-right Nazi groups, drag queens are being inundated with abuse in person and online, and at least 9 different states are currently implementing or trying to implement laws to legally label drag artistry inappropriate for kids and illegal from being able to exist in the public sphere. Laws reminiscent of the old cross-dressing laws we've had only so very recently. These laws don't just affect drag artists, but also inevitably affect gender diverse individuals as well, and I'll discuss the trans community more in part 2. But for now, in our efforts to engage in good faith on this channel, let's ask the question: is drag artistry appropriate for children to view? Now, the simple answer is sometimes. Although the world at large loves to operate in strict yes and no binaries, the unfortunate truth that is difficult for so many of us to grasp is that these things are often context dependent and, yes, I'm so sorry to say, nuanced. Drag artist Cheddar Gorgeous tweets, "Drag can be made age appropriate in the same way comedy, movies, books, plays, or any other art form can be made for and enjoyed by kids. People who treat drag like it's innately perverse do so because deep down they still think of gender non-conforming people as innately perverse. It's really not that difficult to see that some drag is more geared for adults and some isn't. Drag queens who are creating lip syncs to sexual lyrics and doing burlesque performances are totally incomparable to a drag queen sat in a chair at a library reading children's books. In the case of the former, I would argue that it's a parent's responsibility to decide what is appropriate for their child and what is not. One scenario that's constantly referenced by radicalized boomers on Facebook is a performance parents allegedly took their kids to where there was a sign that read, "It's not going to lick itself." Now, firstly, I'm sorry for putting that sign there, but now it's worth noting that a lot of right-wingers who reference these supposed events of sexualized performances in front of kids reference a frankly made-up events that never happened. There have been multiple videos where drag queens in skimpy outfits are actually deep-faked into an audience of child onlookers, which is horrific for obvious reasons. The movement to paint drag performers as monstrous risks to children is incredibly insidious. But even in an environment where we assume all of these events to be totally accurate, which they're not, personally, I think that there's still the responsibility of the individual parent to decide what is and is not right for their kids. Additionally, younger children aren't even going to have a concept for what is sexual about these performances. They're not going to know what "it's not going to lick itself" means. They're going to see colorful, entertaining artists flipping and flopping around a dance floor and probably be entertained out of their minds. They don't know that these outfits are considered kinky or skimpy. These are adult concepts that are being superimposed on an audience that has literally no concept for what that is. So on a personal note, I don't really see the harm in children seeing drag artists performing adult shows at bars where children are present, because the children don't even see these acts as sexual. That's the adults who are trying to ruin what for children is just an innocent enjoyment of something flashy and colorful. One drag show in particular perfectly illustrates this point. It's called A Night Out During the Day, and only children 23 months of age or younger are allowed to attend. It's intended to give mothers a fun thing to do when they've been taking care of a baby and are tired. No child is ever going to remember it, but the mothers will remember enjoying a show that they all consented to as adults. But clips of this performance with mothers and their babies are regularly used as evidence that drag is an evil perversion because children who will never remember it are present in the room. But adult drag performances aside, there's no way you can argue in good faith that a man in a dress reading children's books to kids in a library is sexual. And even saying man in a dress erases the possibility that the person in a dress isn't a man at all, because there are plenty of cis female drag artists and drag artists of other genders who engage in this art form as well. So what about these children book readings do people consider sexual? When I asked conservative family members how they felt about the drag issue, one of them responded that drag queens were sexual because they wore massive fake boobs, and massive boobs were sexual. To this, all I could think about was, what about the cisgender women who have massive boobs? Are they inherently sexual just for existing? Should they, too, be banned from reading to children in libraries and going out in public where children could see them? Underneath negative attitudes towards drag performers exists a much older, much more widely understood issue: misogyny. When we say that drag performers are sexual for having big breasts, we carry those same messages to women all over the world, telling them the same thing. Sydney Sweeney, who played Cassie in the hit TV show Euphoria, recently talked in an article about her challenges with growing big breasts before the other girls when she was younger. This is a problem a lot of girls face. They're growing, developing, and existing, and that existence is apparently inherently sexual according to society. They have to cover up or just cease to exist entirely to be read otherwise. Men don't experience the same thing. There's no part of their bodies that is read as inherently sexual to the outside world. They're not seen as inappropriate for taking their shirts off, for existing in public spaces, for having body types different to other people. It's not sexual to have boobs, real or fake. Hatred of drag performance rooted in misogyny is just that, misogyny, and it's frankly disgusting. But although a lot of hatred of drag artistry is rooted in misogyny, right-wingers can still manage to draw distinctions between female drag performers and their male peers. Cosplayer Cheyenne Jazz Wise made a Facebook post where she says, "Hi, just wanted to take a quick moment to say that there's literally no difference between the volunteer work I do in cosplay and drag queens reading to kids or holding family-friendly events. And if you think anything different, you are a big weirdo." And boy oh boy, did the Facebook boomers have something to say about it. I just want to clarify, as somebody who has been asked to do a drag queen story time, when you get asked to do a gig like this as a drag performer, it is the venue who is requesting you. They get in touch, offer a fee or don't, and you say whether you're available. Drag queens aren't trying to get access to your kids. Most drag queens I know don't even like kids and would rather be nowhere near them. I've seen many people harassing drag performers by saying, "Stay away from kids," and the drag performer in question doesn't even perform in front of children and is like, "Yeah, I plan to." Venues like booking drag artists along with numerous other types of entertainers to entertain, and drag artists do that job as well and as appropriately as any other entertainer who is dressing up and entertaining. A drag queen can show up to a children's story time and give a reading and then go to a bar and do a more sexual adult show later in the night for adults and not kids in the same way that an actor could. There's versatility in art forms and drag is no exception, and it's certainly no more perverse than any other art form. really need to be talking about, like, the cost of living crisis, medical care, the fact that, like, people can't even afford to eat. Okay, but actually, just this last month, over 200,000 illegal immigrants were arrested at the Mexican border, and that's the real epidemic. Wait, what? They're coming, they're taking our jobs, they don't even really want to work, they just want all of the benefits of being an American because we are the greatest and the best. And then you have people within America who are poisoning this good, amazing, incredible country. You have the alphabet mafia, you have the snowflakes, you have all of these people who just think that they can be unicorns flying around in space and they can just be whatever they want to be, and we have to protect their feelings. And then you have these big corporations like Nike who are partnering with people who, like, men who think that they can be women, and, like, they're not like me, they're not like. Conservatives have long been close allies to red herrings. In the 1930s, Herbert Hoover helped California business tycoons paint agrarian labor activism as creeping socialism. Nixon won his first Senate race by sliming his opponent as a pink lady, and Republicans have found Marxist fingerprints on every liberal policy of the last half-century, all with help from the media. We still see conservatives using the scare of communism as a tactic to disguise their platforms and win votes without actually addressing any of the needs of society. But they have a new tool too, and that tool is called groomerism. They don't have the Soviet Union as a boogeyman anymore, so why not look inward? The queer community is right here, a vulnerable, easy target. And the fear that pearl-clutching middle-class America has of gender nonconformity and liberated expressions of sexuality, well, the right wing barely even has to do any work to provoke the biases that are already rampant amongst America's nuclear families. What's particularly upsetting about the right-wing groomer invention is that children are being groomed, and they're being predominantly groomed by people they know in families and in church environments. Religious institutions which make up a lot of the people accusing queer folks of being groomers are often the ones actually responsible for the crime. The red herring is working. Queer people are being legislated out of existence, but you don't see kids being taken out of churches or churches being shut down because people in power are religious and they want you to believe that churches are safe, and that's where your kids should be, and that the real threats, the real enemies, the bad people, are outside church walls. Meanwhile, if you take your child to Hooters, which, unlike Drag Queen Storytime Hour, is actually a sexually provocative space intended to be so, you'll be celebrated for it. Teaching them young, eh? So clearly, protecting children was never really what any of this was about, was it? So to everyone using the word groomer to refer to an LGBTQ+ person on social media, on the news, from the pulpit, the call is coming from inside the house. Why, it's terribly frightening what's happening over in the Soviet Union right now, have you heard? Their new gay propaganda law, formerly entitled The Law Aimed at Protecting Children from Information Promoting the Denial of Traditional Family Values, bans the promotion of non-traditional sexual relations to minors, a reference universally understood to mean a ban on providing children access to information about LGBT people's lives. Books are being thrown from bookstore shelves as if the Soviet Union were inspired by the National Socialist German Workers' Party themselves. Except, that's actually happening in modern-day Russia, not the Soviet Union, and it's not unique to fascist dictatorships, it's happening in the US too. As of a year ago, in Governor Ron DeSantis' Florida, it's now illegal for sexual orientation or gender identity to be discussed in the classroom for students through to grade 3. Now, a year later, he wants to expand it to include all age groups through to high school. According to right-wing individuals, the goal here is to put control in the hands of parents to decide what is and isn't appropriate for their children, as well as protecting all children in public spaces from gender nonconformity. A move that could very well mean trans people could be separated from their kids and forced out of public life. As I discussed in part 1 of this video, these laws aren't new. They're recycled versions of 19th and 20th century morality policing laws, and they're being reintroduced to the legal system by a party who claims to care about freedom, but is actually only interested in freedom for a specific demographic, and anyone who sits outside of that is vilified and politically suppressed. To educate children on LGBTQ+ individuals is not to indoctrinate, it's just to, well, educate. Although the labels and the paradigm of LGBTQ+ and the alphabet mafia is a brand new concept to people, the realities of sexuality diversity and gender diversity have always existed as part of the human experience. We often see these identities as new and as modern because the language surrounding these identities is relatively new and modern, but the humanity behind those experiences, behind those labels and identities, is not new, it's ancient. To outlaw mentions of our existence is to disable effective education about contemporary and historical anthropological demographics. One of my wonderful long-term patrons of this channel uses this book, Before We Were Trans, to educate on gender-complex experiences throughout history. But that's all this is, really, history and contemporary identity. If we can't say gay in schools, then we can't educate our children effectively, plain and simple. In 1919, Jewish doctor Magnus Hirschfeld opened up the first institute for trans individuals to undergo gender-affirming surgical procedures. He wrote numerous books discussing sexuality and trans identity, and his institute was destroyed by the Nazis and his books were burned. But we can't even talk about him and his work in places where queer identity is censored, like the US and Russia. We're literally forced to enact Nazi-era information suppression in modern states to discuss Nazi oppression of queer identity. So when I compare these sorts of anti-LGBT laws to Nazi fascism, you don't get to tell me that that's a hyperbolic statement with a political lean. It's objectively an accurate, direct comparison. The suppression of education and ideas is fascistic. It has a nefarious goal, which is the elimination of understanding of real people who exist. And therein lies a fundamental problem with this whole conversation. LGBTQ+ individuals existing is seen as political. Right-wingers like to separate the person from the identity. Like, we can ban cross-dressing and medical transition and then trans people just go away, right? That's something that my fellow trans community refer to as trans genocide, a practice of legalizing away the possibility of trans experience. But for one thing, trans people can't get erased from history. You can stop us from being able to live freely in the way that we'd like, but you can't erase the reality that there have always been people who have deviated from expected gender norms, even before medical transition. To suppress that understanding is to suppress knowledge itself, history, reality. And of course, trans people continue to exist even when we can't access the tools that enable our self-expression and freedom. We just get either relegated back into the closet, or we're forced to contend with jail time or death as the price to pay for our existence, something that is already the case in many parts of the world. So transgenocide is, strictly speaking, an impossibility, as is the attempt to erase any other queer identity from existence, because you can't just stop humans from having diverse identity experiences. That said, the possibility of legalizing us back into closets and early graves, both things we already battle with more than any other minority group, is absolutely terrifying. When we educate children on the existence of certain people groups, we're not grooming them into becoming those people. I know that Republicans exist, but I'm not a Republican. The gender binary and sex binary have an incredibly rich history of invention, twisting and turning on the whims of men in power. Understandings of both have evolved enormously throughout the 20th century, from seeing all humans as sexually bisexual to our current understandings of sex and gender. When we deny children the option to learn about how concepts of sex and gender have evolved over time, and where trans and gender nonconforming people fit into that picture, we control their worldview, brainwashing them to understand history and the present day through a limited lens. Sounds a bit like grooming, doesn't it? When I was raised, I was told that God was real, that immigrants were bad, that gender was binary. I was groomed into a cis-heteronormative conservative lifestyle, forced to be religious. My education of people different to me was received through an incredibly biased lens. I was, by the Republican usage of this word, groomed into a worldview that was harmful to me and hurt me a great deal. When I began to learn that there were other paths out there that were more suitable for me, that was freedom. Not something I was forced into, but something I was simply made aware of as an option for me. It's worth noting as well that gender essentialism, the idea that women and men are distinctly foreign, binary, biological entities, is an industry with profit motive like many other things in the capitalist market of ideas. In 1992, John Gray released a New York Times best-selling book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, educating that men and women had fundamental biological differences, like men being emotionally disconnected and women having to coddle them and over-explain their needs to men. This book was written on anecdotal experiences by someone with no qualifications to profit off gender essentialist propaganda, and his ideas persist to this day despite having no real evidence to justify them. In similar fashion, a great deal many other individuals have podcasts, books, and TV shows invested in a position of gender essentialism, providing advice to men and women on the basis of largely bogus gender-based assumptions. Gender essentialism is also comfortable. If you're angry because you're a man, then you don't need to do any extra work. You don't need to examine other potential causes for your behavior. It's just your biology. It's just the way that you are. Why question it further? So educating that gender and sex are less binary than gender essentialists want you to believe threatens not just those in power, but also a thriving industry profiting off insecurity, lack of emotional intelligence, and cis-heteronormative relationship problems. Hi, Editor Quinn here. I just got sent this article today by my mom, and I just had to create a little moment in this video to talk briefly about yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is a style of media reporting that emphasizes sensationalism over facts. It was one of the main factors that helped push the United States and Spain into war in Cuba in the late 19th century, and we're seeing it very commonly in regards to reporting on the transgender community. This article here is not at all unusual. I see articles like this all the time referring to transgender people. It's an article that is based entirely on one detransitioner's anecdotal experience of being trans, and yet it's used to draw huge holistic claims around the entire trans community. It uses a lot of sensationalist words, like referring to gender ideology as a cult, which is a very common right-wing talking point, and it says that trans identity and medical transition is something that is dangerous to children. So all of the kind of stuff that I've been talking about in this video. But you'll notice that almost nothing in this article is actually legitimate. It references illegitimate studies, it makes huge generalizations, relies on a lot of anecdotal examples, and even just this headline referring to gender ideology as a cyber sect, which it explains in this article is basically saying that we're just like an online cult. I think it's really important to be able to recognize yellow journalism for what it is, which is just completely illegitimate reporting. We're seeing this style of reporting all the time right now on the LGBTQ plus community, so just be aware of what to look for. This is yellow journalism, that's what it is. It is illegitimate, it's sensationalized, and it's extremely harmful. While we're on the subject of gender ideology grooming, I've spoken in part 1 about the absurdity of drag queens being groomers, but I want to talk now about this new invention that the trans community are grooming children by supporting them in self-actualization. Right-wing pundits claim that allowing kids access to hormones and surgery is grooming because they're not capable of knowing for themselves what they actually want, and they'll regret it later on and be influenced by trans people with their vulnerable little children minds. Now, first things first, a lot of these claims around grooming are rooted in misinformation. Young children aren't offered gender-affirming surgeries, and the only hormone care that kids go on are puberty blockers, which are fully reversible hormone therapy which grants them more agency, not less. I so wish that I'd had access to these when I was younger, and I feel a lot of pity for kids who now live in states where this kind of access is suddenly illegal. I don't understand how Republicans can claim that they want small government and freedom for all, especially families to decide what's right for their kids, but then say, "No, not like that," when people exercise their freedom in safe ways. Also, generally speaking, telling kids you know what's best for them doesn't have great scientific support at being effective parenting. Telling kids, don't do drugs, famously does not prevent kids from doing drugs. And telling kids, don't be yourself because I said so, well, yeah, that one really fucks you up. Just ask my therapy bills. My parents didn't support me in being queer when I was younger, but all that really meant was that I had to wait until adulthood for self-actualization. And when they got angry I didn't tell them I was queer when I was younger, I say, well, you didn't provide a safe place for me to share that. I had to move to a whole nother continent before I felt safe to explore myself. And my family have literally admitted to me that I would have been sent to conversion therapy if I'd come out while I still lived with them. And yet parents are surprised that their kids access gender affirmation without their knowledge and consent. Just recently, this mom complained that her child had been groomed into being trans at school without her knowledge. This narrative of kids being influenced to be something they're not is so prevalent in so many areas of life, and it ultimately comes down to an issue of control. A lot of right-wing folks talk about inability to make decisions before adulthood, but I went through a religious ceremony at the age of 13, marking my entry into manhood. Many cultures start adulthood earlier than 18, some later. We give children enormous agency in some cases and virtually none in others. You can drive in California at the age of 15, which is objectively infinitely more unsafe for you as a child than anything related to gender exploration. Why then can't you also have bodily autonomy? And look, I'll admit to you, okay, so firstly, I'm literally, my legs are so sore. Okay, this is a tattoo that I got when I was 18 years old. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, like, it's a cat reaching for a music note, and it's not really, like, the most beautiful, artistic, stunning tattoo out there. And I'll be the first to admit, I regret that tattoo. Like, I have a full sleeve now of tattoos, and I have a bunch on my thighs that I don't regret. This is the only tattoo that I regret. But I'll give the Republicans that one thing. I have done a permanent change to my body, which I did regret. It's this one very small tattoo. And, you know, like, I'll probably cover it up at some point. Like, I don't love it anymore. But I will defend to the death my right to have accessed that tattoo. Even though I was too young maybe to make the perfect decision of myself, even though I've changed massively as a person, and even though I've grown out of that style, even though that's not something that currently gives me joy or really fits into my current aesthetic or my sense of identity, I had a right to access that. I had a right to make that decision for myself. And you could say, well, you were 18, you're right, you were an adult, but you weren't a child. I was barely 18. What difference would it have been if I was 17 getting that tattoo? If I was 16 getting that tattoo? At the end of the day, at some point, we have to decide that people have bodily autonomy. They have agency. They're going to make some decisions that they regret, and they're going to make some decisions that they don't regret. But ultimately, we can't control everyone. Sure, I got a tattoo when I was 18, I regret. People absolutely change their minds. Kids change their minds. Abigail Schreier writes in her book Irreversible Damage about people who regretted transition, about how hard it is to detransition and how dangerous medical transition is for children. But the thing is, getting older is also irreversible damage. When I went through a testosterone puberty, it left marks on my body which have been incredibly challenging for me to undo. Had I had access to puberty blockers as a child, I wouldn't have had to go through grueling, expensive, painful surgeries which risked my health just to undo the effects of testosterone on my body. Anti-trans writers like Abigail are so close to understanding discomfort with one's body and the desire to change it, as well as the right to do so. She perfectly understands the discomfort of detransitioners who regretted the damage done to their body by testosterone, yet has no understanding or empathy for people like myself who have that same discomfort. Because ultimately, she isn't interested in having a conversation about bodily autonomy. She wants bodily control for parents and ideological control within society. She wants trans people eradicated. She doesn't have empathy for us as human beings, but rather as pawns to scaremonger parents into joining her war against gender freedom. I don't believe that children should just go around seeking out gender affirmation willy-nilly. I'm not telling you that it's not a big deal. I'm not telling you that surgeries and puberty blockers are just completely nothing. At the end of the day, having safeguards in place is important. It's absolutely important to have a conversation with yourself, to go to therapy, to do loads of reflection, and to be sure that gender affirmation is what's right for you. But self-actualization should not be gate-kept for people beyond the age of 18. There isn't some arbitrary moment where we, as adults, should say, alright, you're allowed to self-actualize now. Ultimately, self-actualization is about you. It's about your body, and nobody, not politicians, not parents, not random YouTubers and influencers on the internet, gets to dictate that for you.
I just believe that, like, everybody should do whatever is right for themselves, their body, make whatever choices feel good for them. Like, we're not living in a free country until absolutely everybody, yourself, myself, can make whatever decisions are right for ourselves, with our bodies, with our gender expression, and not face prejudice for that.
Okay, but kids can't consent to hormones and surgery. I definitely wouldn't have been able to consent to that when I was younger, which is why I waited until I was an adult, like a sane and normal human being, to do my medical transition. When you tell kids that they can be whatever they want, you're grooming them into a delusional world where they can just be any gender or anything, even though that's not real life. And the thing is, hormones and surgeries are irreversible.
Okay, Maddie, but like, if we were interested in actually being honest, right? Kids don't undergo any other hormone replacement therapy other than puberty blockers, which are totally reversible, and kids don't undergo surgery for gender-related reasons unless, like, they're intersex and being genitally mutilated into conformity.
Whatever, I just want to protect kids from grooming, okay?
What does that word mean to you exactly?
When it comes to conversations around gender, anti-trans people love to bring up the fact that words matter. And I agree, words do matter. Words like groomer. Grooming does happen to kids. I've mentioned where it happens, and I want to make it very clear where it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen at drag queen storytime readings. It does not happen by trans women in bathrooms. It does not happen in classrooms where educational content is provided around gender and sexuality. If you want to focus on definitions of words, let's get that one right first. Thank you so much for watching this video, and especially a huge thank you to all of my patrons who supported me in creating this content and who are absolutely integral to me being able to continue to create content like this. It really means so much. If you found this video helpful and useful, I would love for you to share it around. I believe a lot in the message of this video, and as members of the LGBTQ+ community and any allies, anybody on the left wing, we need to understand that these kinds of conversations are going to keep happening whether we participate or not. And I realize not everyone has the energy to jump into these spaces and to debate and battle with people they disagree with, but we need to have a conversation. We can't just let the right wing establish a narrative about LGBTQ+ people. We need to debunk things that are just obviously false. So feel free to use this video as an educational resource, as a rebuttal, as a link, as a reply to a Twitter argument, whatever. I'm very happy to stand in and have these kinds of conversations personally. And to my beautiful, wonderful fellow trans community and to the drag artist community, I love you. Keep being beautiful and vibrant and visible. Every day you exist, every day you show up, every day you are present in this incredibly hostile world. You are so powerful, and I am with you, and I love you, and I look forward to continuing to be on this planet with you. Brought to you by these boots. Yes, these boots are my entire personality these days, and I'm not sorry about it.